We are going to get started with our next speaker. First of all, I would like to once again thank all the speakers for being here. I would like to thank the sponsors of the events themselves. ASA sponsored, American Sport Fishing Association sponsored this lunch today. But without the speakers and without the sponsorships, we couldn't do what we're doing. So the next speaker is someone I've known now for, I believe, 11 or 12 years. He's an avid angler and outdoorsman. He's become a good friend over the years. We've actually been able to bounce ideas off each other, talk about the issues that pertain to this industry and the sport that we both love quite a bit, online and off. He's Vice President of Government Affairs at American Sport Fishing Association, based in Alexandria, Virginia. He joined ASA in 2009 as the association's policy fellow, so that's a volunteer position almost, Mike, isn't it? You don't get paid much. Yeah, paid internship. And holds a master's degree in fisheries management from Auburn University and a bachelor's degree in fisheries science from Virginia Tech. So obviously he loves the sport, and he is one of those that when they went for the fisheries field, he did it because he loves fishing and has a passion for it. He oversees the association's public policy activities on a variety of natural resources and trade issues at a national, regional, and state level. And he's a great example of an individual that's in this industry because he's got passion for the sport. And with that, I'd like to introduce Mike Leonard to the stage, and he's going to talk to us about some things that we all need to be aware of with regard to what we can do to help the future of our sport.
All right, thanks, Pat, and thanks everyone for being here. Appreciate the opportunity. When I saw that I was going after Sid Dobrin on the agenda, I was a little bit nervous because Sid and I both spoke at our Sport Fishing Summit, and I went after Sid, and when I introduced him as Bob Marley. So I was worried what comeback he was going to have. At the time, he said, "No, I'm not Bob Marley, I'm Bob Marlin," which I thought was pretty good. I don't have the clicker, by the way. So we can work on that. But yeah, so I'm going to talk today about getting involved in fisheries policy, the world that I live in at ASA, to help ensure the future of our sport and why it's so important to do so. Thank you. But first, a little bit about us at the American Sport Fishing Association. So we're the trade association for the recreational fishing industry. So companies that make, sell, distribute fishing tackle, manufacturers, wholesalers, retailers, outdoor media, a few other categories, but that's sort of the bulk of it, a lot of the sponsors that many of you all have. We were founded in 1933, so we just came up on our 90th anniversary last year, and we're based in Alexandria, Virginia, just across the river from Washington, D.C. We're known for a couple of things, at least within the industry. The first and probably most popular is ICAST. How many of you all have been to ICAST? A lot of you, many of you. So we produce ICAST each year, world's largest fishing tackle trade show. It's been in Orlando for the last several years, will be for the foreseeable future. Sort of the Super Bowl of fishing, although I think Johnny Morris has stolen that term from us. But great event, and that's sort of what our bread and butter, and great opportunity for the manufacturers to show off their latest and greatest and interact with retailers and buyers and others within the industry. The other thing that we specialize in that maybe goes under the radar more is government affairs. And so I oversee our government affairs team. We have a great team, folks, that you can see on the screen here, of professionals, both in D.C. and around the country, that work on the policy issues that ultimately impact fisheries conservation and management and access all around the country. And so I work in D.C., I work with a lot of other industries, and I'm always interested to sort of compare what we do with others. And there's a lot of other industries, companies out there that essentially have there's this one policy, there's one regulation, this one tax that they're lobbying for or against, or federal funding for this one thing. In our industry, it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's hundreds, thousands of different regulatory entities, federal, state agencies, state, local, national levels, fishery by fishery, region by region, state by state. So it's a lot to keep up with, especially when you layer on top of that all the trade and commerce stuff that we do for our members. So even with this great team covering pretty much the entire country, we're still kind of only scratching the surface. We're having to prioritize what are the biggest, most important issues impacting the industry and the community that we can get involved in. But we're, I think for the size of our team, we're certainly punching above our weight. So a little bit about recreational fishing. I'm sure you all are familiar with it, but in terms of the magnitude, but putting a little stats behind it. So latest numbers, there's 54.5 million people that fish each year. Collectively, almost a $1 billion, 1 million jobs impacted by recreational fishing. So this isn't just, the manufacturers, retailers, but if you think through the whole trickle-down effect, essentially if recreational fishing went away, how many jobs would be lost in the country? Almost 1 million. Similarly, $148 billion a year economic impact. So huge industry. We're part of something called the Outdoor Recreation Roundtable at ASA. It's kind of a conglomeration of all the different trade associations within outdoor recreation. So RVs, motorcycles, camping, you name it. And collectively, so we've pushed the federal government to measure how much does outdoor recreation impact the national economy. And it's about 2.2% of gross domestic product is attributed to outdoor recreation, which may not sound like a lot, but it's 2.2% of the entire nation's economy being outdoor recreation is pretty big, especially when you compare it to other industries. It's bigger than agriculture. It's bigger than oil and gas, mining. So it's a major impact. And within that, fishing and boating is the largest contributor to the economy of all outdoor recreation activities. So that's something we at ASA are constantly pushing, that fishing's not just, this great, fun, leisurely activity, but it's also a huge economic driver throughout the country, and therefore deserves bigger policy consideration. Something we're also very proud of as an industry and community, and talk quite a bit about, is our commitment to conservation, not just talking the talk, but walking the walk in terms of our financial commitment. $1.8 billion estimated each year annually that goes towards conservation, between fishing license purchases, all that money going back to state fish and wildlife agencies to do habitat restoration and conserve fisheries and ensure they're well managed. Same with the excise tax on fishing equipment that our manufacturers pay. All goes back to support conservation, access, things that benefit the environment and benefit fishing, as well as direct contributions. So we are an industry that really, I think more than anyone else, more than all the environmental groups, are really footing the bill for conservation throughout the country. We operate on a pretty simple model, which has gotten a little bit more complicated over time, but still the foundation is if you have more fish, you'll have more fishing, you'll have more business. And especially when you add on to that the funding system we have here, where the more fishing you have, the more business, the more tackle you have sold, the more license dollars, the more excise taxes that ultimately go back to conservation to create more fish. Very virtuous cycle. Of course, we're, over the last several decades have learned it's not just as simple as if you build it, they will come. As long as we have fish, people will want to go fishing. So as an industry and state agencies working through the Recreational Boating and Fishing Foundation have been putting a lot more emphasis on what we call R3, recruitment, retention, reactivation, of how do we grow the sport and bring people into it, as opposed to just, relying on the traditional model of, my parents, my grandparents are going to take me and I'll naturally take up the sport. There's a lot of competing interests out there that we have to be actively pushing people to spend time out on the water. So Glenn Hughes, our president of ASA, spoke at this conference, Pat told me, in 2019. So he gave me his presentation. He gave you all 10 things that you can do. I can barely remember 3 things. So these are great things. I'm not going to do 10. I'm going to do less. I also was looking really closely at this picture. This was his Christmas card. I don't think that's Photoshopped. I don't think it's Dolly or whatever. I think Glenn actually went out in a Santa costume and caught a speckled trout. I haven't asked him yet, but it seems like something he would do. It seems like something Glenn would do, yeah. So I didn't do that for my picture. So I'm going to give you 3 things, not 10, 3, but I'm going to flip it and do 3 things not to do. And those are: do not take fishing for granted, do not sit on the sidelines, and let's stop with the infighting as a community. So first, do not take fishing for granted. I think we as a community, as folks that have lived and breathed this all of our lives, or at least most of us, there's definitely a taking for granted of fishing. It's this inherent right. It's something that's always been around for generations, always will be around. No one's against it. We're going to keep doing it. And I don't think that mindset's something we should be able to take for granted or just assume that that'll happen if we don't stay vigilant. So the information here came from, it's an ongoing study that Colorado State and Ohio State do where they monitor Americans' wildlife values and essentially put people in these different buckets. So one of those is mutualists, and that actually makes up the plurality, so the largest group of Americans nowadays, are people who associate with animals as companions deserving of care and even rights similar to people. So that we and animals are all on the same level playing field, and that animals have rights and welfare that need to be considered at the same level as humans. Traditionalists, which my guess is most of us here in this room would probably put ourselves in that bucket, are people who view wildlife as a resource that should be managed and used for the benefit of people. That's 28% of the population nowadays. There's then sort of the mixed bag of group of people that are pluralists, who it sort of depends on the context or the situation, whether they would put themselves as mutualists or traditionalists, somewhere in between. Maybe most concerning is the number of distanced people who just exhibit very little interest in wildlife. That's 15%. So what's also interesting is if you look at changes in trends over time. So the percentage of mutualists over a 14-year period went up 6%. Percent of traditionalists went down 5%. And a lot of that's reflected just in changing demographics, urbanization, just people disconnected, sort of the Disney effect. So if you look across all those categories, what we view as traditional views towards fish and wildlife management, of conservation, of wise and sustainable use, that's only 28% of the population that has those values consistently. And again, it's trending in a slower direction. So that's, again, something where if the attention gets drawn on fishing and a lot of public negative stigmas are put towards it, there's a large portion of the population that might turn on us pretty quickly. So taking that out, just looking at the threats from a sort of broad standpoint, what are we looking at? I, a few months ago, polled a bunch of probably 40 or 50 people that I consider to be experts in fisheries policy conservation. Pat was one of them, Gene, a few others. Leaders of fisheries, conservation organizations, state fish and wildlife agencies, and asked them a bunch of questions, including what do you view as the biggest threats that we as a community, as the recreational fishing community are facing? And there's a lot of sort of weighty stuff that came up: water quality, climate change, funding, technology, which has been a common theme here, habitat loss, invasive species. Big things that you can't just sort of flip a switch and fix, that we're just going to change overnight. Again, 54.5 million of us collectively may be able to have an impact, but not if we're sort of sitting on the sidelines, not paying attention. That's in addition to the sort of day-to-day stuff. So don't worry about reading all the things that are up here on the screen. I'm merely trying to impress you with the sheer magnitude of words here. These are all issues that when I asked ASA, our staff, what are we working on, in a very active day-to-day level, issues that we're trying to directly impact, either get a positive impact, positive outcome, or minimize the negative impacts to our industry. A lot of stuff going on throughout the country. As I said earlier, there's not just this one policy that impacts fishing. It's all region by region, state by state, fishery by fishery. So a lot for us to keep up with. So again, back to that point of, fishing's always been here, always will be, something we can take for granted. You really don't have to look far to see that things can change relatively quickly, and I'll give a few examples, both globally and then here in the U.S. So Australia, over the last 10 or so years, the government there has gone through a pretty quick process to establish massive marine protected areas in all the coastal waters around the country. And there's not a whole lot of fresh water in Australia, so most of the recreational fishing that takes place is in the ocean. And over that time, about 45% of the marine waters of Australia have been placed in a marine protected area, most of which are areas you're not allowed to fish with. And if you actually look at the magnitude, the impact that has, it's really greater than 45%, because these areas tend to be the best habitat, therefore where the best fishing is. So about half of the ocean waters around Australia are essentially no fishing zones. And was there science behind this? Was there some clear fisheries management challenge that needed to be addressed only by closing areas off? No, it was just sort of a emotional, political, this sounds like a nice thing to do, and we're not getting a whole lot of resistance, and people will think we've done a good thing, so let's go ahead and jam this stuff through. So we're seeing marine protected areas in the U.S. coming down too. So another example, probably even more concerning. So you look to Europe. There's several countries in Europe where catch and release fishing has been banned. In Germany, back in the 90s, they passed the Animal Welfare Act that states no one may cause an animal pain, suffering, or harm without good reason. And apparently the courts decided recreational fishing's not a good reason. And this is something Pat and I have talked about a lot, of this whole fish feel pain movement of that catch and release is mean and evil and something that we shouldn't be allowing. And I think a lot of people in this industry are quick to brush that aside as just, nonsense, something that's never going to happen. I hope it doesn't happen during my career. I hope it doesn't happen during any of our careers, but I am certain that at some point in the future in the U.S., we are going to have to grapple with this discussion of, do fish feel pain and is catch and release evil? Because there's continual studies that are being put out of people just looking for any sort of excuse, any sort of justification to be able to say, yes, fish feel pain and catch and release fishing's mean. I've always thought it was interesting. Someone in the industry pointed this out years ago. If you catch a fish and the choice is, do you let the fish go back in the water or go in the cooler? I bet if you were to ask that fish, the fish would say, I'd rather go back in the water. So it's interesting to me that the government said, no, kill that fish. That's the right thing to do. But, again, that's something that I think as a country, hopefully not anytime soon, but at some point, and we've already seen in other places, may be coming here. And just think of the impact that would have to our industry. Bringing it back to the U.S. So as much as I love fishing, my true passion in life is whitetail deer hunting. So I've gotten really into hunting and follow a lot of what's going on in the hunting industry. And because a lot of times what you see happening in the hunting industry is just sort of the first step, and it's going to come to fishing at some point in the not too distant future. And if you look around the country, there's a lot of concerning stuff going on with regulation of hunting. Recent example in Washington State, where the state in 2022 banned its spring bear hunt. And was there a science-based reason for this? Was the bear population in trouble? Was this hurting sustainability rates for bears? No, it was just sort of an emotional, some animal welfare and environmental groups decided to seize on this sort of emotional argument that these poor mother bears are coming out of hibernation and you're shooting them and orphaning their cubs, and no data to support that, no science to support that at all. It was just sort of, let's seize on emotional heartstrings and push something forward through a commission that's supposed to be managing based on sound science-based fish and wildlife management. But the problem is the Washington State Commission over the last few years has been populated with commissioners that don't hunt and don't fish and don't share those traditional fish and wildlife management values. And again, you can look at that and say, I'm not a bear hunter, I don't live in Washington State, kind of, sucks for them, but that's not going to impact me. But trust me, this is just sort of the first step. And there's interesting theories in the hunting community that I think are grounded in, you try and understand where is this coming from. And the theory is that these animal rights groups have realized we're not going to be able to just ban hunting outright all at once. So the way we're going to do it is we're just going to sort of slowly chip away at it one by one, death by 1,000 cuts, where you sort of take the ones that don't seem to have a lot of strong public sentiment. There's not a whole lot of hunters. Maybe even the other hunters won't defend those guys. And we'll just start slowly banning those one at a time to where eventually there's not a whole lot left. And at that point, you can just sort of come in and get rid of it all. And I truly believe that there's a lot of solid grounding behind that argument. And again, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen over the course of a year. But if you let that continue to chip away over time, it's going to eventually erode to where the whole activity goes away. And like I said earlier, what happens in hunting, it doesn't take long before it starts happening to fishing too. And then the last big policy I'll mention is an example. Over the 15 years I've been at ASA, the most consequential regulation I've seen had started a year and a half ago, and we're waiting for the final regulation to come out. But this was a draft or a proposed final rule that the National Marine Fisheries Service came out with 2 summers ago that will likely get finalized here in the next few months. And it is the right whale vessel speed rule that would essentially take the entire Atlantic Ocean from Massachusetts down to central Florida and effectively make it off limits to any boat 35 feet and up to go offshore. It's slow speed zones, so 10 knots, but essentially if you want to go offshore for half the year, you're not going to be able to because of these speed zones. All because of the less than 1 in a million chance that you might encounter an endangered North Atlantic right whale over that time frame. Extreme overreaction to a conservation concern that could be addressed in much smarter ways than this. But again, points to if we just sort of sit back and idly let the government run things without any sort of speaking up, weighing in, there was all sorts of problems with the analysis that the National Marine Fisheries Service did with this. They didn't consult with anyone within our industry. They clearly don't have an understanding of how our industry works and how these boats operate. So tons of overestimates of risk and overestimates of the magnitude of these strikes. But if left to their own devices, this is the type of thing that we can come up with. And we're pushing back, fighting as hard as we can against this, and it'll likely end up in the courts, but something that points to the fact that if we're not vigilant, not staying on top of these things, a lot of bad stuff can happen. So don't sit on the sidelines. Don't just sort of sit back and think, okay, these things sound bad, but what can I do about it? Hopefully you guys can figure all that out. And I often think part of the inherent struggle we as a community have, those 54.5 million anglers, is if you think about what drives you to fish, we've got some different motivations behind it. But for a lot of people, it's, get away from life's problems, get out on the water, relax, enjoy nature, despite all the technology that, maybe interfering with it at times. And so then what I'm trying to do is, well, let me take that hobby that you use for relaxation and peace of mind, and let me add a whole bunch of messy, complicated, contentious policy fights on top of it, where you got to, read dozens of pages of environmental impact statements and understand the impact of these regulations. So I get that, there's this inherent, like, no, that sounds messy, and let me just go fish and leave this stuff alone. But if you truly care about this sport, if you truly care about the future of it, you can't just sort of have that mindset of, I don't want to worry about that stuff, someone else deal with it, because as a community, we're confronting a lot of serious challenges that are going to require everyone stepping up and having an impact. I mentioned that survey I did of a bunch of fisheries professionals asking for their opinions. One of the common themes when I asked, what do you think are some of the weaknesses of our community, of our industry? Common refrain was apathy, and this quote summarize that well. The majority of the fishing population appears apathetic to the conservation challenges confronting the fishing community unless they're directly impacted. And I'd argue a lot of times you're directly impacted and you're still apathetic. You're like, what can I do? Someone else can address this, or it's going to happen regardless, so, oh well, no big deal. And again, it's not something we can continue with that mindset without some serious negative consequences. So what can you do? I won't give you 10 things, just a few. Track what's going on in your area. I'm sure many of you keep track of what's going on. Work with your state DNR, state fish and wildlife agencies. Understand what regulations they're working on, what management plans they're working on. Get involved. Attend meetings, provide input. The refrain, think globally, act locally. It's easy to sort of look at these big challenges we're dealing with, climate change, water quality, drought, lack of access, crumbling infrastructure, and think, I can't do anything about that. 54.5 million people, if we individually are taking action, you can collectively have a huge impact. All those voices collectively do matter, do make a difference. Get involved with fishing organizations. Obviously, if you're here, being a part of NPAA is a huge, important step towards that. But be involved in your local, state fishing clubs, fishing organizations, national organizations. Work on having leadership roles. This is sort of the tip of the spear. The way that things get done is through that collective organization of people sharing information both ways. Of, hey, here's an issue coming up in your region, get involved. Or conversely, and this is where Pat and I talk a lot of, hey, Pat will tell me, Mike, I'm hearing from someone in Wisconsin, someone in North Dakota about an issue that's going on there. And so it funnels its way up too. That involvement, that action is really, really important. And for those of you, again, with big followings, with big influencers, with big social media presences, use that platform to help spread the word. I know sometimes that can be tough, that you worry that's not what people are here for. They don't want to hear about these policy things. But I mean, we see a lot within our industry of companies that do it because they know it's the right thing to do, but also know that you can create brand loyal consumers, customers, when they see that, hey, AFTCO, Sims, Yamaha, they're working on issues that impact the future of conservation, the future of this sport. That's a good thing. That's something that I want to support. I want to help support that company in that mission. I think the same's true with a lot of fisheries professionals, where your followers might not know about these issues, might not totally understand the grasp of them or the depth of them, but if they see you engaging in the future of our sport, I think that's going to be a huge benefit. And one of the great ways to know about what's going on, track these issues, we have a lot of information on our website, asafishing.org. We've got an advocacy platform there called Keep America Fishing. So if you just go to our website, easy to find, and you can quickly and easily sign up. And anytime an issue, we don't bombard you, we don't spam you, but anytime an issue is coming up, whether it's a federal bill where you need to contact your senators and representative, or if there's a regulation in your region that you need to comment on, we make it as easy as possible. Here's the information about the issue, here's who you need to contact, here's the message delivered, just a few clicks, get that in there. And again, opportunity to share that with many, many others, because those collective voices can and do make a difference. So if you go to our website, we, again, try and synthesize it, put it in as much layman terms as possible, and when issues are coming up, timely send information out. And then I'll close with what I said before about stop with the infighting. And this was another common refrain from that survey I sent around about weaknesses of our community is Each segment of the community looks out for its interests, whether it's a species, the resource, whether fresh or salt that affects its interests, the techniques they utilize to target fish, or the geographic region in which they live. Sometimes we as a fishing community are our own worst enemy. You know, you've got the native fish people against the hatchery fish. You've got the sort of catch and release versus the catch and harvest. I mean, you name it, harvest techniques, the gear you're using. We get so bogged down in fighting against each other. I don't like the way that guy fishes, that we can't see the commonality in what we're all here for. And an interesting sort of comparison, Larry Phillips, who's our Pacific Coast director, works on fisheries issues out in the West Coast. He's out of Washington State. He used to be with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. He wasn't responsible for the spring bear hunt fiasco, but he works a lot with a lot of the tribes up there, and he noted that, you know, when you get the tribal representatives behind closed doors, they're arguing, they're fighting with each other, they hate each other, they can't get along. But the moment they step out and interact with anyone else, they are all unified on the same message, all, you know, preaching the same thing, because they know if they're divided amongst each other, they're not going to get anything done. And I think we, as a community, have a lot to learn from that, because while we're sitting there arguing with each other of, I think the striped bass slot limit should be 29 to 31 and we shouldn't allow trophy. You know, while we're sitting there doing that, environmental groups, commercial fishing industries running laps around us because they're just loving the fact that we can't get organized, can't get our message together. And that's, I think, been a huge, huge detriment to ours. So that would be my message to all of you, anyone that you can preach that to, is let's figure out how to see the commonality that we have, the much bigger threats we have besides each other, and work on moving ahead collectively. So thanks, everyone. I'll close here with this one quick little anecdote that sort of reflects back on some of the things I was saying earlier. So I've got young kids. I was putting some just happy, smiling fishing pictures together, but the top right there is my 7-year-old daughter. So last summer, we were going to do a daddy-daughter date, and I asked her what she wanted to do. And she said she wanted to go catfish jugging with me, which I thought was awesome. It's something I do fairly often. So I took her out. She only made it about 45 minutes. But we caught a few catfish, had a good time. So I was like, this is great. You know, she's going to be my hunting and fishing buddy. So then fast forward to this past fall, you know, I'm trying to, you know, introduce my kids to this stuff, especially on the hunting side, so that it seems like a familiar activity for them. I had harvested a doe, and I took her with me to go retrieve it. And boy, did that backfire. So she gets up to the doe and like starts getting tears in her eyes and said, oh, and I'll never forget these two things she said. She said, she looks so beautiful. And then the second thing she said was, I bet she was a good mommy. So, it's like, wow, ouch. I'm even gonna have to think about that one. So my point being, while I've given you all a lot of to-dos coming out of this, clearly my to-do is to work on my daughter's mutualistic, Disney-fied attitude towards fish and wildlife management. I'm working on it. My son there in the bottom left corner, I've taken him fishing a bunch. That's his first trout he caught this past summer. So he doesn't seem to have that issue. My daughter, I think daughters just tend to be that way. They just a little bit more work and a little bit more struggle at times. So I'm going to work on that while you all work on getting more involved in fisheries policy. So with that, Pat, I don't know how much we've got in terms of time left, but happy to answer any questions if there are any. Thank you. Over here. A net negative would be my guess. I mean, yeah, you know, there's commercial fishing licenses, but nothing near what recreational fishing. I mean, we deal with that with a lot of states where, and it's even interesting looking in some states' budgets of how much of state resource attention goes towards commercial fisheries management versus recreational fisheries management. When you think of the fact that recreational fishermen are footing the bill for most state DNRs, and yet a disproportionate amount, especially in terms of favorable regulations, oftentimes, this is not intended to be a blanket statement across all state fish and wildlife agencies, but questions we have in certain areas of the disproportionate focus that goes towards the commercial fishing industry, given the relatively little amount of funding that they're providing to help manage and sustain those resources. What's that? They're not as well organized. They've got a handful. If there was a similar event like this within the commercial fishing industry, they'd probably make some of the same points I do about fracturedness and lack of cohesion and that type of thing. It sort of depends on the industry. But yeah, there's a handful, but they don't have a comparable sort of national umbrella organization. That doesn't stop them from still running laps around us at times. Sid?
Going back to your bear hunt analogy and the lack of science in that policy, from your perspective, and this can just be a yes or no question, but probably a longer answer, when the Modernizing Recreational Fishing Act was passed, one of the key components of that act was an increased attention to science and data before policy could be enacted. From your perspective, have we actually seen more attention to the science and data regarding policy, or did that act, was that just merely, lip service to science?
Yeah, not substantially, but it's sort of changing the trajectory of a large, freight ship, that these things tend to take time and move pretty slowly. So, yeah, we've got all sorts of challenges with the National Marine Fisheries Service, from management, data collection, science, you name it. So I think it was a nudge towards doing things better, but we still have a long ways to go. We've since then found out that within the National Marine Fisheries Service, so there's the Office of Protected Resources, which is the endangered species, right whales. That's like, as bad as we thought the sustainable fisheries part of NOAA was, the Office of Protected Resources that's doing this right whale rule seems to have even less of a need to focus on science and good governance. So.
How do we, for different agencies and organizations, we look at our FWC commissioners, we look at commissioners from other states. Many of those commissioners, as you have pointed out, don't have the exposure, the background, and they're appointed by our governor. So how do we change that process of getting the right people in the right positions in order to do what's best for our fisheries and for our wildlife? I'm also a big hunter, so I see it from both sides. It's mind-boggling who's on our commission for so many states, not just Florida, but almost every state. And you come out of college and you go through and you don't have that education, but yet you're still appointed to these boards.
Yep. I wish it's a question I've asked a lot of others and tried to wrap my head around too. What is sort of that threshold of qualification to be able to serve in that capacity? Is it traditionally, again, it wasn't really much of a question, because if you're going to serve on a Fish and Game Commission, inherently you need to have some requisite information, and that was understood. And nowadays with these government appointees of just, let me do a favor for someone that helped me in my campaign, or hey, I've got an agenda to push, and who's going to help me push that agenda? It's not an easy question to answer. An oversimplified solution that a few of us have talked about would be, at a minimum, have you purchased a hunting or fishing license for the last 5 years, something like that? Do you have at least an interest, a background, passion in this? It wouldn't solve all the problems, but it's at least a start and an indication that you've had some interest in this prior to the commission appointment. The problem is we've tried that in a few states, and governors don't like being told limitations on their ability to appoint things. Right.
So the Max McGraw Foundation in Illinois, Chicago, they've started a program where they are educating individuals who are coming out of college and bringing them in, much like your governmental affairs type positions and people of that. They're bringing them in for a summer and educating them on fishing, hunting, getting them hands-on experience. Would that ever be something, and I know, would that ever be something that we could implement in different states, or get something within ASA where we can bring people in and give them that, maybe it's not, it's a weekly or it's a monthly experience, that they at least get some idea, because some of the policies that were determined regarding different species of fish were determined by people who'd never targeted that fish, caught that fish, or had anything to do with that fish. You take them out on a boat. We took them out and showed them the species
Yeah, no, it's worth a lot more thought and consideration. I mean, it's you want to pull your hair out a lot of times listening to some of the comments from commissioners who, you know, speak with authority about something that's just so factually incorrect, and a lot of it just comes from that lack of firsthand knowledge, experience, understanding of how Fish and Wildlife Conservation works. And I know that, you know, there's the National Conservation Leadership Institute, but that's generally working on people that are already in the industry or in the fisheries management professional sphere. So yeah, it's a great point, and again, something I think collectively across the fishing wildlife space we need to think a lot more about of how do we ensure that the the future generations of leaders that are making these decisions actually understand and appreciate the issues they're. Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
Rick's got a question.
She's got a great point, but to go with that point, those decisions we each make, just like Washington's overwhelmed by people who have a different view than many of the people in this room have, we're being overwhelmed in middle America right now, and that is Nashville's change to become Hollywood. So think about Tennessee making a total cultural change. So what has happened is that culture has overtaken Nashville, and those same policies and society changes are happening in that state. And then when it happens in middle America, you start controlling the Bible Belt. When you start controlling the Bible Belt, you change the culture across the country. And rural America then changes. And our challenge is inside of ourselves as to how we change that. We change that by voting, good or bad, by one person. That one mark you make is one grain of sand for a municipal office, for a treasurer, that opposes your view personally. You may like that person. They may be your friends. You may play cards with them. You go to ball games with them, whatever. But if they culturally oppose your view and you vote for them, you voted for what you just discussed. It's one vote at a time. And we're becoming a tolerance of society that we tolerate that. And it's a time of intolerance that will change that.
I think you need to get up here and give a speech at one of these conferences. Yeah. 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 Anyone else here? Evie?
How many states are represented, like how many state agencies are represented in ASA? Is that something that we could go back to our states and encourage?
Yeah, we'd love that. I think we have around 20 or so that are currently involved. At the same time, you know, there's the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies that is the umbrella group for all of them. We work really hand in hand with them. But, you know, I think states like South Carolina are a shining example of understanding the value, Florida too, of the relationship between industry and the state agency and the very symbiotic relationship. And I think some states do better of that than others, of appreciating the importance of the industry, not just nationally, but especially the ones in their state that are paying excise taxes and supporting their mission. And yeah, I think the more involvement, the better.
They could definitely provide that science source you need on a lot of occasions.
Yeah, yeah. And two, I don't think all states do, but I know of some that have, you know, for the sport fish restoration funds that are coming in, they have advisory bodies set up, filled up mostly of industry to help provide some sort of consultation, collaboration of, you know, what are you all's priorities? What do you want to see? Where do you want to see these funds go? And again, it helps solidify that relationship of this is industry funding that we're helping to provide services for. How can we make sure that we're doing this in everyone's best interest? Anyone else? Gene? Yeah, so yeah, I mean, Keep America Fishing is just sort of the, here's what's going on, but for that information to trickle up there, obviously BASS is a close partner, NPAA, the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, Coastal Conservation Association. If you're happy, I could give you like a list of the good ones and then maybe the, the ones to steer away from, but yeah, I mean, if you're seeing a group that's got a good mission that's supporting, whether it's a state, national level, because I didn't show it, but when I was doing that survey of the 40 or 50 professionals in fisheries science and management, one of the positives that came out from that is as fractured and apathetic as the community as a whole is, organizationally, we do work pretty well together. I mean, Pat, Gene, Chris Horton with Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, folks at Coastal Conservation Association. I mean, we've got from a professional standpoint, a lot of organizations that are collaborating constantly. I can't think of a single issue that just ASA is working on. We are constantly collaborating and collectively working together because we all bring a different perspective, different expertise to the table. So really just getting your foot in the door with any of these groups is ultimately collectively going to trickle itself up to the whole group. Sid?
You didn't mention them, but going back to the question about working with the state agencies, RBFF does a really excellent job of reaching out to a lot of the state agencies also. I know that at their conference in February in Atlanta, they'll have representatives from most of the state agencies there too.
Yeah, RBFFs, I'm jealous of them because they get to do the fun participation stuff. I do the ugly, messy policy stuff. But yeah, great organization in terms of that R3 stuff that I mentioned earlier. Get more anglers involved in the sport. They stay very, very far away from advocacy for good reasons, but it's all part of building the coalition. Yep.
Mike, you've made a great point. I think it's one we need to resonate here, and that is that getting involved when we hear something. Usually, you mentioned going to meetings. Every single government meeting I've usually attended was already preset, their format, their template. They were just telling you what they were going to do. We're looking for your input, but we already decided this.
Yep.
And that's what they really do, and they've already made those decisions when they have those public meetings.
Yep.
Turning them there is too late.
Yep. That's why you.
To turn them here. For example, at home, we just had a Walton Foundation, and I live in Arkansas. Most people don't know this, but Walton Foundation, huge benefactor in the state of Arkansas, obviously. Northwest Arkansas is the #1 per capita population of millionaires in the world. So there's a whole culture in Northwest Arkansas that's becoming Hollywood, you know. It's a different culture entirely. Great amenities along with that, but also a change in that culture. So the Walton Foundation got behind a push with Buffalo National River to nationalize the National Park Service to take the whole river over. And they would format the template. It's a national river. It's the first national river in the United States. Gene's aware of this, I'm sure. But they were going to take that over and make it just like Lake Mead National Park Service. And the questionnaires that the Walton Foundation presented were laying out, well, wouldn't you like better access? Well, if anybody's been to Lake Mead, you don't get better access. You know, it's not going to give you free reign to your national park. It's going to restrict access. Yes, they're going to put a road in where they want it. And so it took a local initiative to change that, but had the Walton Foundation not been challenged on that, they would have. They were very close to taking that and putting it into the National Park Service within 2 years.
Yep.
And that happened within the last 4 months, and several of us got engaged with senators, representatives, and stopped it. But we had to stop it. Actually, the first place it was stopped was the Walton Foundation presented us a questionnaire, certain people involved in the outdoor industry. The questionnaire was presented in such a fashion that you could not be opposed to it. So the questions were very strategically labeled so that no matter how you answered, you would seem in favor of this move. Because we all want better access.
Sure.
We all want to improve it.
Yep.
But the questionnaire, so now, well, this is a good idea. And there were a few pivotal people that got involved and improved that.
Yeah, the number of initiatives I've seen the Walton Foundation fund that hinder fishing tackle sales at Walmart stores is mind-blowing. It doesn't seem like the right hand knows what the left hand's doing. So,
They're different entities.
oh yeah, I know they're separated, but sort of. So yeah, no, but to your point about the decisions being made, I mean that's where it takes kind of the whole community coming together. Where the picture I showed of our staff, I mean the staff that we've hired are folks that have typically worked for these state agencies or worked for these commissions that know the people that are making the decisions behind the scene. So they're able to have those sort of in the hallway conversations before the decision's being made, but that alone doesn't often solve it. You need bodies, you need people speaking up. So again, we're sort of all in this together. Pat's standing, which I think means I get to get off the stage. So thanks everybody for your time.